You're listening to Switched On Australia, the podcast that tracks the opportunities and challenges of electrifying everything, everywhere. Switched On is brought to you by the publishers of Renew Economy, Australia's best informed, most read website focusing on the green energy transition, and is supported by Boundless Earth, using philanthropy, investment and direct advocacy to help Australia become a global force in a decarbonised world. G'day and welcome to the Switched On Australia podcast. I'm Anne Delaney and I'd like to start by paying my respects to the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation in northern New South Wales. This is where I live and I work. Today we're going to take a deep dive into a massive and growing problem with embedded energy networks. Now, in theory, embedded networks allow for the bulk purchase of energy, electricity, gas, water, from an energy retailer, usually at a discount. They're being installed in apartment blocks, caravan parks, retirement villages, and also for commercial tenants in shopping centres. But the reality for many owners and tenants on an embedded network has turned out to be very different. Not only are they not getting a discount, they're often paying well above ordinary retail rates for their power and water. And to make matters worse, owners and tenants are getting locked into inflated contracts for years. They simply can't escape. That's because the developers of apartment blocks and other strata buildings are entering long-term contracts with embedded network operators on behalf of the owners and tenants, and that's in return for getting the embedded energy network to build the energy infrastructure for free. To find out how this has been allowed to happen, I spoke to Kathy Sherry, Professor of Law at Macquarie University. Kathy is also an executive member of Macquarie's Smart Green Cities Group and the Environmental Law Centre. And I started my discussion with her by getting her to spell out exactly what these embedded networks are.
So at its base, an embedded network allows for the bulk purchase of energy or water, it's usually energy, by a group of people at a discount at a parent meter, so coming in from an energy retailer. And because you're buying in bulk, you buy at a discount. And then the theory is that all of the members of that group of people then get their energy or their water at a discount. And the places where you're likely to see groups of people like that are in shopping centres, if we're talking about commercial tenants, or in land lease communities, which are caravan parks, retirement villages, but the really big growth area is in strata and community title. So that's, apartment buildings and master planned estates.
So how extensive are these embedded networks? I mean, how many of them do we have? Do we know?
They've been growing incredibly rapidly. So the numbers at the moment are probably since it was last reported. I mean, there are thousands of them in Australia, but they're probably growing every single week. So they've grown incredibly rapidly in the last sort of 8 years or so. So we know that in New South Wales, we started out in 2013 with 900 households in electricity embedded networks. And that's actually ballooned to 95,000 households in electricity embedded networks and 64,000 with gas and hot water embedded networks in 2022.
That's a massive rise. And what accounts for that rise?
What accounts for that rise is two things, is high density development, but also a desire to have good energy infrastructure. So what's actually driven quite a lot of these embedded networks are local councils approving developments that might have green infrastructure. So a good example would be something like Central Park in opposite UTS near Central Station in Sydney. A lot of people know it as it's the plant covered building. So it's a building with plants on the facade. And there's an example in the federal inquiry that refers to that, where the City of Sydney quite rightly wanted renewable energy resources and infrastructure in that building. It's got a tri-generation plant, it's got recycled water. Councils want developments that have good energy infrastructure, so they tend to approve them. That's driven a lot of embedded networks, because the theory is, of course, that embedded networks don't have to be renewable energy, but they can be. So A, it's a way of people getting, in theory, cheaper electricity, but B, it can actually be electricity that's sourced from renewable sources. So that's driven a lot of it. And then, of course, in recent years, it's just the high density development that's happening all around Australian cities. So particularly in Sydney and also in Melbourne, there's an enormous amount of high density development occurring. And it does seem that whenever it's happening, embedded networks are being put in apartment buildings.
So, as you said, in an ideal world, these embedded networks should be bringing discounts in for the consumers. But in reality, what are consumers experiencing?
Consumers are having a very bad experience. So 3 parliamentary inquiries, federal inquiry, a Victorian inquiry and a New South Wales inquiry. And the New South Wales inquiry heard evidence of, for example, a customer being billed $9,700 for 14 months of hot water. People are certainly not paying below retail rates. There are examples of genuine embedded networks where people are paying. So one example in the federal inquiry was Stucco, which a lot of people might know as the housing cooperative that's co-owned by Sydney Uni and the Department of Housing, that's in Wilson Street in Redfern. They have an embedded network that they retrofitted the building with, and their tenants are getting a discount. But the embedded networks that seem to be in strata schemes that have been built by developers, people are not getting a discount, and they simply can't escape. There's no alternative. They can't get out of the embedded network. They can't get electricity directly from other suppliers. So the theory, and I think probably quite a lot of us are sceptical about the market theory that having a multiplicity of retailers provides us all with better energy prices. Some of us are old enough to remember when those days did not exist, and I remain unconvinced that I'm getting better prices as a result of competition. But anyway, that's the theory, that with competition, consumers get better prices. But in an embedded network, it's not possible for retailers often to provide energy, alternative retailers to provide energy or hot water to people who are in embedded networks. So they don't get that supposed benefit of competition. They're locked in, whether they're owners or whether they're tenants, they don't have an alternative. And the reason why they're not getting a discount is because of the existence of embedded network operators. And so this is the key to why they're not working. And I think that this is something that energy regulators have not been on top of, because this is something, the real problem relates to strata law. So if I can explain how problems arise. What developers are doing is they are getting embedded network operators, which are third-party companies, to install the energy and other infrastructure, so gas, electricity, hot water, stormwater, infrastructure in buildings for free. In return for the developer causing the owners corporation, and that's the group that's the separate legal entity that's made up of all owners. Every strata scheme has an owners corporation. So you buy an apartment, you're immediately a member of the owners corporation. So the developer causes the owners corporation to enter into a long-term contract with the embedded network operator. So if we get those kind of 3 parties clear in our mind, there's the developer, there's the owners corporation, which is a separate legal entity from all of the owners, but they're automatically a member of it. And then there's the embedded network operator business. So the embedded network operator installs all of that infrastructure for free. And the way they are paid for it is the owners corporation will be bound to them through a long-term contract to pay for electricity, hot water, gas, whatever it is. And that contract will be drafted in the interests of the embedded network operator. There's certainly no obligation for them to pass on the savings that are made through bulk purchase at the parent meter. And that certainly seems to be what's happening, that there's no obligation to pass on that saving. They're not doing it, and they're often charging above market rates.
So how long are some of these contracts?
Well, there are limits to infrastructure and energy contracts in the Strata Schemes Management Act to 3 years, but embedded networks are exempt. They're excluded.
Why?
Some of these, To try, and because I think people thought it was a good idea that we have embedded networks, and also because, look, I've worked in strata a long time, and anyone who knows anything about property in New South Wales knows that the property industry has always had a very, very heavy hand in property regulation and in particular strata. And so my guess is that developers or embedded network operators convinced the government that it was essential that they be able to do this, because of course this is a long-standing practice in strata, and I'll talk about different examples in a second. But what the embedded network operators will be saying is, look, if we put in all of this infrastructure for free, we have to be able to get our money back. It has to be worth our while. We've got to be able to recoup the money we've paid out. I'm not sure that many people in the industry are thinking, well, maybe that's a poor system to start with.
Yes.
Maybe you shouldn't be putting this infrastructure in for developers for free in the first place. Maybe it should be just something that developers pay for, and if there is an embedded network and an owners corporation needs a professional to help them manage it, there could be a short-term contract that the developer puts in place, but then very quickly it's replaced by a contract that's actually negotiated by the people who own the building and own that infrastructure.
Yes, is
And
chosen by the people who are actually going to be using that energy and paying for that energy.
Exactly. And any contract that is negotiated by somebody who doesn't have to pay it, that is the developer, is not going to be a good contract for those people who do have to pay. So I should also say that this is a long-standing practice in strata, and I think that this is where one of the reasons why there's been such problems with embedded networks and so much activity. So energy regulators have been looking at this for many years now, so upwards of 5 years. But I don't think that anyone who's looking at it has strata expertise. So what they haven't realised is this is really standard practice in the strata industry, and it's caused problems for decades.
Right.
So by way of example, for people who are in northern New South Wales and Queensland, they might be aware of a thing called management rights, which is where a lot of your tourist infrastructure, so a lot of your places where tourists stay, are actually privately owned strata schemes. So they're not hotels. So when people rent an apartment in Byron or in southeast Queensland, they're very often staying in a privately owned strata apartment. And the thing that makes it seem like a tourist development is a management rights business that is installed over the top of the strata title property ownership. And what happens is exactly the same thing that's happening with embedded networks. The developer builds the development. While they control the development initially, they sell the management rights to the building. So whether it's Q1 or a Manta or Peppers, those kind of developments, the developer will sell the management rights, and that is the right to manage the building, deal with the rent roll that comes from short-term holiday letting, cleaning the pool, doing all of those other things that might need to be done in an apartment building that is actually a tourist operation. The developer will, and in Queensland this is actually legislated for, it's legal under the Queensland legislation, the developer will sell the management rights. It's a business, it's a package, a management rights package. It's a business that people buy. They pay the developer a certain amount of money. It can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then they are installed as the manager, and in Queensland under the legislation it can be a 25-year contract.
Good grief.
And then and it's in theory disclosed, in theory people know this when they buy an apartment, but they buy in and they discover that they're stuck with this management business for 25 years. They are now a member of the body corporate. It's the body corporate that's a separate legal entity that's bound to this contract. They have to discharge the obligations of the body corporate. If the body corporate has a contract to pay, they have to pay for it through levies.
So the owners have no choice on this management rights company at all. They have no say over what they can do.
No. So the contract is in place, and in theory it is disclosed, but people often don't understand that when they're buying. It's hard to know. You can't know its good value until the business is up and running. Management rights have caused a huge amount of dispute in Queensland. So it's happened in relation to management rights. It initially happened in relation to strata managers. So developers initially, a few decades ago, used to install strata managers. They'd install building managers. Strata legislation has been gradually amended over the years to try and minimise the impact of those contracts, so they can only be initially for 3 years, and then the owners corporation gets to renegotiate their own. But very often it's difficult for them to do so. The strata manager, once they're in there, some of them are great, some of them are really good. I don't want to malign the strata industry. Some of them are not. and they'll be voting through proxies. There's all sorts of nefarious stuff that happens in strata. But embedded networks are just another example of what's been happening for decades in strata, and that is developers using their initial power to control the development, to make the owners corporation enter into a long-term contract for the benefit of the developer and an associate of the developer, and it doesn't benefit the people who actually live in the building.
So if this has been going on for decades, does it just, I presume it points to the power that the developers have within Australia. I mean, what are the main challenges in trying to get better regulation into some of these agreements? I mean, what do you see as the potential solution?
I think I've actually been thinking a lot about this lately, and I think one of the main challenges is, and I'm allowed to say this because I'm an expert in strata law, is the sheer boredom of strata law for a lot of people. So many people, seriously, people just, I'm not deluded. I can see people's eyes glaze over and they look for the nearest exit to see if they can make a run for it when I say I research strata law. In strata law, some of it's really interesting, some of it's technical and really boring, and I actually think that this is a major issue, that people don't want to know about it. They don't want to learn about the detail. Very few lawyers specialise in strata. And then there are a lot of people, urban planners and sociologists, to their credit, are actually really interested in the complex communities that are created by strata schemes and master planned estates. But not a lot of other people are interested in it. So there's not a lot of expertise. There is a major problem in government that although government is forever facilitating high density and master plan development, so it's a huge thing, particularly in New South Wales at the moment. The government is very, very big on high density development to try and solve Sydney's housing problem. It won't solve the problem. Supply will not actually fix the problem, but they're very big on it. But there is so little understanding of strata title law within government, it's shocking. And I'll give you an example. I did some research during the pandemic on the lockdown orders, stay-at-home orders, and the strata industry, people were tearing their hair out by the fact that the public health orders during the pandemic were literally identical for a freestanding house sitting on 500 square metres as they were for a high-rise building with 500 people living in them. The legislation made no distinction. And as a result, it was completely nonsensical for strata schemes. So just to illustrate this is, most people will be shocked to know this, when we were all, and this is not anti-lockdown laws, but when we were all locked down, unable to leave our houses, see our families, even if we were COVID negative, at no point was it ever illegal for somebody who was COVID positive to walk out of their apartment, go all through the common property of a high-rise building, use the gym, use the pool, use the laundry room. That was never illegal. I mean, I'm sure people didn't do it because they were conscientious, but it was always perfectly legal to do that. And that's simply because the drafting of the legislation was so bad, the Department of Health did not realise that residential premises does not mean an individual apartment. It means the entire building for a strata scheme. They literally did not understand the meaning of that. They had not thought about what does the term residential premise mean for a high-rise building as opposed to a freestanding house. Right. And I just cite that as an example of this is the kind of problem that arises because nobody in government seems to actually understand the absolute basics of the legal structure of a strata scheme. And so when it comes to things like embedded networks, it's really hard to fix this problem if nobody understands how a body corporate works and how a developer can manipulate it.
So, Kathy, if you were in the position where you could do something about it, what should government be doing?
Government needs to prohibit developers causing bodies corporate to enter into any kind of contract. Mm-hmm. And so I should clarify, when I use the term bodies corporate, that's the kind of generic term because we're talking about owners corporations and strata schemes. We're talking about community associations and neighbourhood associations in community title developments, so they're all legally the same thing. Government needs to stop developers allowing, being able to cause a body corporate to enter into any kind of long-term contract. The American strata title industry, they call it condominiums there, almost collapsed in the 1970s because of this kind of developer abuse. So the kind of condominium boom in Florida in the 1960s and 70s, terrible developer abuse with developers making bodies corporate enter into contracts that benefited the developer and their associates. the condominium industry got such a bad name that the industry almost collapsed. The government had to have a big inquiry, and one of the things they put in place was a provision in their Uniform Condominium Acts that says that any contract formed by a developer can be terminated on 90 days' notice by the owner's corporation. And what that does is remove the incentive for any business like an embedded network business or a management rights business or a strata manager, doesn't matter what it is. That removes the incentive for them to provide services to a developer for free in return for a long-term contract, because there's no guarantee that they'll get a long-term contract. So they don't provide those services to developers for free. What they do is what is entirely appropriate. They negotiate with the owners' corporation made up of owners. So there's no doubt that there are businesses that we need that service owners' corporations, but those businesses should be negotiating with the people who are actually paying for their contract. And that's the owners' corporation made up of owners, not the owners' corporation initially controlled by the developer.
And do you reckon something like that, a 90-day period where the contracts can be terminated, do you think that's the sort of thing that we need?
Desperately. We desperately need it. And because what's happened is, I refer to it as whack-a-mole. So it's like playing whack-a-mole. What the government does is they enact specific sections of legislation. So, for example, in the New South Wales Act, you can't have an energy contract for more than 3 years. If it's been formed in the initial period, it can be terminated after. It's not meant to run for more than 3 years. But then you get carve-outs like for embedded networks. But also what happens is we can't necessarily dream up what developers are going to think of next. So there've been provisions in the legislation for over a decade now about limiting the length of a strata management, a contract that a developer can form with a strata manager or with a building manager. And they were put in place before anyone had thought about energy contracts or embedded networks. So those provisions were of no use when we started to get energy contracts and embedded networks, because they're very specific provisions that talk about strata management contracts and building management contracts. So if you put in specific provisions of legislation like that, you end up just having to play whack-a-mole when a developer thinks of yet another way they can form contracts.
Get around it.
Yeah. And that's what lawyers will do. So as soon as I saw a newspaper report about exploitative hot water contracts, I immediately knew, right, some clever lawyer has worked out energy's regulated, water's regulated, put the two together, hot water, that's not regulated. It falls between two stools in relation to the legislation, because legislation is very carefully and precisely worded. So if you don't fall within the wording of the section, then you're not regulated. So we need a broad provision that just says any contract,
yes,
including all of those ones that we've not yet dreamed up. 20 years ago, nobody would have thought about EV charging contracts.
Yes.
It's not something we would have thought of, and we're getting them all over the place. People putting in EV charging facilities for free in return for a contract that binds the owner's corporation. So they're happening everywhere. So we desperately need that. The other possibility, and I won't go into this in any detail because it's too much technical law, but there is a case in New South Wales that says a developer owes a body corporate a fiduciary duty, and fiduciary duties are the highest duty you can ever owe in law. It means you can only act in the interest of the person to whom you owe the duty, and if you don't act in their interest, any profit you make you have to cough up and give to them. So there is a case in New South Wales that says that. That would be an incredibly useful test case for embedded networks, to say that if a developer owes a fiduciary duty to the body corporate it creates, it can only act in that body's interest, and if it doesn't do so, it's breached that fiduciary duty and it's liable for any profit it made as a result in relation to selling the embedded network contract, which is in effect what you're doing when you get the facilities provided, infrastructure provided for free.
That's going to be a very interesting case to watch. Now just to put on my developer's hat, which is not a hat that sits or fits very well on me.
Yeah.
But just looking at it from the developer's point of view, when they build these buildings, sometimes they don't have owners for each of the apartments, say, for instance. Don't they have to set up relationships and contracts in order just to get the power in, the energy in, the hot water in, the electricity into the building to actually be able to sell the apartments?
Yes, I mean, often they actually have sold the apartments because all apartments in new apartments are sold off the plan in Australia, which means the building is literally not built. Off the plan means the strata plan hasn't been registered. It hasn't been registered because the building hasn't been built, because you can't draw a strata plan to thin air. You actually draw it to the building. So they actually have sold the apartments, usually at that point. But yes, it is a fair enough point that you've. Well, put it this way, developers have been building buildings with energy infrastructure in them for decades. This is a new phenomenon. It is entirely possible to build a building with all of the energy, with all of the, the wires, all of it there. This is energy regulation and energy markets are not my area of expertise, but I believe that some of this stems from a change that Gemina made about 10 years ago. I'm not going to attempt to speak to that because it's not my area of expertise. But certainly and certainly also when it comes to things like embedded networks or even, for example, management rights, the developer would say, well, if people buy into a building that appears to be, they've bought an investment property, it's a tourist, it's meant to, they know it's going to be let out to tourists, you want some kind of management structure in place. That is actually a fair enough point to say, when you're buying into a building like that, if it's got an embedded network or if it's got it's a tourist development, you want the initial structure in there. That is actually fair enough, but those contracts should only be for maybe 1 or 2 years until the owners are in a position to make those decisions for themselves. Because, at the end of the day, with strata title, what you're selling is ownership. That's what it is. People are not buying a bundle of shares in a company. Like, as a shareholder, you don't assume you're going to kind of have a huge say in the running of a company. That's not what strata is. People are purchasing land and they assume, and they are owners, and the simple reality is when it comes to strata legislation, the buck stops with the owners. The ultimate authority in any strata scheme is the owners' corporation. They can be assisted by strata managers and building managers, but those people are just agents. The ultimate people with responsibility for that building are the owners. And that's actually a huge problem we have in strata, that a lot of people don't realise that when they buy. They think somehow somebody else is responsible, and they're not. They are.
You mentioned the New South Wales test case that's coming up, but do you know of any success that apartment residents have already had in challenging these unfavourable contracts, or is it just impossible?
Well, the test case is not actually yet happening. I'm suggesting that would be a good test case. There is a case that's been successful, a case called Arrow Asset Management, and that was about management rights, but that was decided about 10 years ago. But in relation to embedded networks, I mean, a test case would be great, but it's not yet happening.
Oh, okay.
Are there other ways? People have been challenging it via energy law, or there was a case of someone who managed to challenge. They were a tenant. They challenged it through NCAT and was successful. So a lot of the focus is on energy regulation. That the idea, and there's to the credit of many government departments. So the Australian Energy Market Regulator, IPART in New South Wales, which is the Independent Pricing Authority, they've all been looking at this, and EWON, the Energy and Water Ombudsman, they're trying really, really hard, but they're all coming at it from the angle of energy market regulation.
Right.
And they've had some success, and maybe that's an answer, but as a strata lawyer, I can see that the root of the problem is strata law. And even if you fix one thing, something else is going to pop up.
Yes.
And the reason why this is so pressing, it is so incredibly important that we fix this, is because of net zero, and because of the fact that I think everyone accepts now that we desperately need to reduce emissions. We need renewable energy. So the whole push from government and from the private sector is going to be getting renewable energy resources into buildings. It is estimated by 2050, 45% of Australia's energy is going to come from DER, distributed energy resources, which are privately owned energy generation or energy management systems. So solar panels on people's roofs, privately owned batteries, EV chargers, all of those kinds of things. That's a staggering amount of energy, 45% of Australia's energy. So not coming through, big energy providers, but privately owned facilities. Strata title is a prime target. And it's for this reason. All strata buildings have common property, which is everything that falls outside your individual apartment is common property, and it's collectively owned by everybody. So that gives you a place that you can physically site this kind of infrastructure, which whether it's EV chargers, a battery, solar panels, a trigeneration plant, any of that kind of renewable energy infrastructure. The moment you whack it on common property, it's a fixture and it belongs to everyone. So you can have way more complex renewable energy infrastructure than you could ever have in an individual house. So I don't think anyone's going to own a trigeneration plant in their own house. A high-rise building can have one because it's a really big building and you've got lots of people. So you immediately have a property structure that allows that infrastructure to be collectively owned, and you have a statutory structure that compels people to pay for it. So you have a levy system. So when you buy an apartment, every year you have to pay levies for the upkeep of the common property. That's, painting the stairwells, fixing the lights in the car park, all of those things. But if it's a trigeneration plant, it's paying for that as well. So as soon as it's on common property, you have a statutory obligation to maintain it. Everyone collectively does. That makes strata a really, really clear, and master planned estates that use the same legal structure, a really clear target. And just to explain that to make that more comprehensible, imagine a street with freestanding houses and you want them to have shared solar panels or a shared battery. There isn't anywhere to put it. There's no shared land. You've got 20 houses in a street. Where do you put the battery? There isn't anywhere. There's no land that they share. You have no capacity, you have no ability to make them pay for it because this is just a rule of ordinary property law. You cannot sell an ordinary freehold title, which is what you buy when you buy a house in the street, and impose on it an obligation to pay money. Just take my word for it, as an ordinary rule of property law, you cannot do that. And that's the levying provisions in strata are specifically enacted to overcome that rule. So with ordinary houses in a street, there's a reason why when you buy a house in a street, the only thing you're going to be paying is council levies. You're not going to be paying for your vendor's cleaner or something that the developer's cooked up. You can't be made to pay for that. So if you had a battery, say for a whole street, you haven't got a way of making people pay for it. And there's also no governance structure like an owners corporation that allows people to manage that battery. So putting in renewable energy resources for ordinary residential subdivisions is actually really hard. People owning their own solar panels, that's fantastic. People can do that, and there's a huge uptake of that in freestanding houses because it's actually much easier than in a strata scheme. But when it comes to a lot of this new renewable energy infrastructure, strata is going to be an absolute hotspot for it because of the legal structure of strata schemes. You've got a way of people co-owning it, and you've got a way of making people pay for it, and you've got a way of collectively managing it.
So that is really interesting. So while we wait for the changes in the law so we can get 90 days to terminate these really unjust contracts that a lot of apartments are locked into, and considering all these complexities and the legal nuances, what advice would you give individuals or communities facing just challenges with embedded networks or other contractual obligations?
What I would say to existing strata schemes who are stuck within embedded networks, and this is tenants and owners, is agitate and speak up, because I'm absolutely certain that one of the reasons why things don't change in strata, particularly for owners, is nobody wants to be too upfront or public or honest about problems within their building, because really the only way to escape problems is to sell. And I think this has happened with, for example, building defects. People tend to keep mum about them because if you're too loud about it, your one sure method of escape, selling, you might actually harm it. But I think the strata industry, people who own in strata, need to speak up more. So that's for existing buildings. Speak up and speak out and say, this is unfair. This is our building. We own it. It is our right to determine what happens to the infrastructure that is in our building. It belongs to us, no matter what a contract might say with an embedded network operator. The infrastructure of the building belongs to the owners. It's on common property. It is their property, no matter what a contract says with the embedded network operator. So I think that people should be speaking out. I think people need to be more engaged. This is a kind of chronic problem in strata that, as I said before, people buy in thinking, oh, the strata is responsible. There's no such thing as the strata. It's them. The owners' corporation's responsible. So I think a lot of people have bought the kind of myth that if you buy an apartment, you don't have any responsibility for maintaining things, unlike a freestanding house. Nothing could be further from the truth. You do have responsibility for maintaining it. You've just got to do it with 200 other owners, and whatever you've got is bound to be way more complex than a freestanding house. People have to understand that you buy in strata, you've got to engage with that. I suppose for people who are yet to be affected by an embedded network, the answer is check. Make sure you really understand. So, when you go and look at an apartment to buy or you go and look at an apartment to rent, don't just look at the granite bench tops. Actually check the contract. Make sure you understand what you're signing up for. Particularly investors. And I say investors because investors are the people who actually have a choice. Because one of the real problems we have in this area, and one of the things the government is likely to do, is try and use disclosure as a way of solving this problem, saying, well, as long as we disclose it, as long as we tell people there's an embedded network, that makes it okay. Because if they choose to buy or rent, they've made an informed choice. Nothing could be further from the truth. We know perfectly well that for thousands of people in the Australian housing sector, people looking for housing, whether they're buyers or particularly renters, they don't have a choice. So this idea that, well, if you don't like what you see, you just don't choose it, you choose something else. People frequently, particularly renters, have no choice. We all know that people are renting whatever the hell they can afford. That's how it goes. So the idea that they can simply choose something different is a bit of a fantasy. But to the extent that people can choose something different, be informed, find out, ask the hard questions before you get tied into one of these places. But then I'd actually say the people who really have a choice, and to be honest, I wish they weren't in the apartment market at all, but they are investors. Nobody forces you to buy an investment property. When you do it, do so in an informed way. Don't just think, oh, it's a widget, it's got nice granite bench tops, I'm going to buy it because I can negatively gear it and I'll get a capital gains tax deduction when I choose to sell it. Make sure you're informed about what you're buying, and investors are the people who can actually vote with their feet and choose not to buy it all or buy something different. So if we're going to have investors in the market, and I'd prefer we didn't in the housing market, but if we're going to have them, if they can exercise choices and not choose embedded networks, that would help.
I suspect, Kathy, as one of the few strata law experts in the country, that your expertise is going to be increasingly called upon. Kathy Sherry, thanks so much for joining the Switched On podcast today.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And Kathy Sherry is Professor of Law at Macquarie University. Now, you might have heard Kathy briefly mention that the practice of locking owners and tenants into long-term contracts for electric vehicle charging is also starting to happen. So we'll follow up on that issue in another podcast. Stay tuned. That's it for this week. I'll see you next time.